Humanities Council. I'd like to welcome you on the behalf of the South Dakota Humanities Council, which produces this annual Festival of Books. We hope that you'll enjoy the festival and we'll provide feedback about this year's event. The link to our online survey is available at the South Dakota bookfestival.com. It's sdbookfestival, one word.com, or the QR codes that are found in your information tables. You can help keep the festival free by making sdhumanities.org or use the slips available at the South Dakota Humanities Council information booth in the Oscar Larson Performing Arts Center here in the middle of the atrium. With your gift, you can enter our drawing for a print of our festival guide cover image by Brookings artist Chuck Bennis. Donate $50 for your first entry and $10 for every entry after that. This festival would not be possible without the generous support of the numerous organizations and individuals who have already donated and are acknowledged on the back cover of the festival guide. In today's program, let me move over here. I will have Allan C. Carlson present. Allan C. Carlson holds a PhD in modern history from Ohio University and has taught at Hillsdale College, Gettysburg College, and the Catholic University of America. For 2 decades, he served as editor of Marriage and Family Studies for Transaction, the publisher of record in International Social Studies. His books include The New Agrarian Mind, and as editor, Land and Liberty, The Best of Free America. Carlson also wrote the introduction and annotations for the 2020.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. And in fact, this is a brand new publication. It came out of the box last night for the first time. It's a wonderful edition. It's got that portion of that famous painting by Harvey Dunn, The Prairie is My Garden, which resides here on campus. And it's an almost perfect, I think, expression of what the novel is about. How should we read and understand Giants in the Earth in the year 2024? In my introduction to this centennial edition of the book, I argue that Giants should be seen, like it was really in the 1920s when it first appeared, as a major work of American literature, unique in power and scope. While focused on a handful of immigrants in the southeastern corner of Dakota Territory, it chronicles one of the most remarkable migrations of a distinct people in human history. And yet it is far from being a parochial account of one ethnicity. Rather, Giants is a direct expression of O.E. Rolvag's strong dedication to cultural pluralism. Rejecting both Anglo-American preeminence, also rejecting the melting pot model, he affirmed a vision of the United States as a democracy of ethnicities, a unique place where Hispanics, Asians, Africans, Native Americans, and Europeans could and should preserve their languages and identities. Now, this is a view of the American identity finding new affirmation in our time. Finally, Giants is a splendid example of modern agrarian literature, the kind that began to spring up in the United States in the early 20th century. In his dedication to economic democracy, localism, and environmental awareness, Rolvag is a direct intellectual ancestor to contemporary writers such as Joel Salatin and Wendell Berry. Now, in my talk, I will be focusing on the first part of this explanation, specifically the epic nature of the Norwegian migration to North America. I will begin with a retelling of the author's own immigrant story. Ole Edvard Pettersen was born April 23rd, 1876, to a Cotter family in Nordland on the northern coast of Norway above the Arctic Circle. For 6 generations, his people had resided on Rolvag Cove, from which, as an immigrant, he would take his American surname. As Cotters, his parents received use of a basic cottage and a small parcel of land in exchange for occasional service to the Koldervin family on the Donis estate. Petter was a fisherman in the frigid waters around the nearby islands. Surrounded by mountains and fjords, the boy found all of nature to, quote, be alive with the supernatural. On a more somber note, he once remarked that, I can almost say that I spent my entire childhood in a struggle with the Arctic. Rolvag had a strong attachment to his mother, Ella, who was the root, the soil, and the sun of his own being. Later commentators, including Rolvag's own daughter, Ella Valborg Tweet, have suggested that the strong and complex female characters in his fiction, most notably in Giants, were inspired by his mother. By Rolvag's own account, he was a runt of a boy, showing little promise. In that time and place, formal schooling amounted to only 9 weeks per year and aimed primarily at preparing the children for confirmation in the local Lutheran parish church. Ole was a slow, troubled reader with a poor singing voice. His older brother, Johann, was the scholar and the chorister in the family. Rolvag explained that his real education took place at home, for this was the parents' duty. I remember well my mother sitting at her loom with a child on either side of her, each reading a book, or father mending his fishing nets, one of us standing beside him with a book. At age 15, Rolvag was confirmed in the parish church at Nesna, so ending his formal education in Norway. His grade, almost very good. Rolvag joined the family business as a fisherman, growing in strength and gaining a reputation as proud, obstinate, and aggressive. Life in the family cottage grew especially hectic during the Advent season, as the men prepared to spend the next 3 months after Christmas in the Lofoten Island fishing grounds, rich in spawning cod. In January 1893, a terrible storm struck Lofoten waters. Facing a fierce wind and dense sleet, Rolvag almost died. It was then that he began to contemplate immigration to America. He sent a letter to an uncle here in South Dakota, asking for a prepaid ticket that he would work off after his arrival. The ticket did not come, and Rolvag continued as a fully sharing crew member in the boat of a brother-in-law, Johan Olsen. During the evenings, Rolvag intensified his own reading. In 1896, a near legendary skipper, Christian Andersen, offered to buy Rolvag his own fishing boat to be paid off over time. However, the prepaid ticket had finally arrived, and he turned down the offer. I am going to America. Well, why did he emigrate? Biographers Theodore Jorgensen and Nora Solem conclude that he needed more room. He needed larger opportunities. More broadly, even at the age of 20, he had a sense of ambition, even of destiny. As he wrote in a diary he began to keep on his departure, only weak spirits go down. And I feel within me the surge in powers. His initial plan was to work in America for about 8 years, save $1,000, and return home to Nordland, a relatively rich man. On July 29, 1896, he said farewell to his family and set off for America, specifically for Elk Point in the southeast corner of South Dakota. There, Rolvag joined his uncle, Jacob Friedrich Jacobson, and became a hired farmhand. He found agrarian life in South Dakota puzzling. Farms do not have any names here in America. How do they manage? Rolvag was particularly stunned by the expectation that he care for cows, which was exclusively women's work in Norway. Imagine a grown man sitting down to pull a cow teats. A man is dairymaid. Seeking better pay, he joined the threshing crew in 1897, marveling at the massive machine, yet troubled by what would now be called its dehumanizing effects. While a local Lutheran pastor loaned him books to read, Rolvag found few other hired farmhands interested in discussing literature or scripture. In summer 1898, he made a life-changing decision. He would enter the Augustana Academy in Canton, South Dakota, a boarding school operated by a local Lutheran church. Here he would meet John Berdahl, a fellow student. Berdahl's sister, Jenny, would marry Rolvag in 1908, and his father would be a primary source in the drafting of Giants. At age 22, Rolvag was 7 years older than the other incoming students. Partly due to this maturity, though, Rolvag quickly excelled. On graduation in May 1901, he gave the commencement oration. Remarkably, a newspaper account survives. Quote, Mr. Rolvag laid down 3 conditions to the acquisition of true culture, namely a mother tongue, a national characteristics, and the faith of forefathers. He contended that by losing the first of these, that is, a mother tongue, one loses his nationality and becomes a sort of international vagrant, belonging nowhere. By the loss of the last, that is, faith or religion, the morals of the person and of his ethnicity degenerates. Remarkably, this high school speech neatly summarized the life mission, Rolvag's own phrase, that he would pursue until his death 30 years later. Giants was its most significant expression. He then enrolled at St. Olaf College, founded in 1874 on Manitou Heights in Northfield, Minnesota. Norwegian and Lutheran in its conception, it became in 1899 a college of the United Norwegian Lutheran Church in America. From its founding, a year's instruction in the Norwegian language had been a required course. Again, Rolvag excelled in his studies and gave the commencement address for the class of 1905. College president J.N. Kildall was especially impressed and offered him a teaching job at the college. The condition was that he first spend a year of graduate study at the University of Oslo back in Norway. Kildall also offered him a loan to cover the expenses, which Rolvag accepted. Once again, his ambitions were quite clear. As he wrote back to his fiancée, Jenny Berdahl, from Oslo in late 1905, regarding efforts at a first novel, it wasn't the thirst for vainglory which made me try to write. I wanted to do something for Norwegian America on a large scale, and I thought I could do this through authorship. These were actually heady times in Oslo. 90 years earlier, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the great powers of Europe had forced a Norway just freed from Danish control into a union with Sweden. Under this dual monarchy, the Swedish king reigned in both Stockholm and Oslo, while the Norwegians kept their own parliament, the Storting. On June 7, 1905, after decades of mounting tension, the Norwegian Storting voted to dissolve the Union, an action grudgingly accepted by the Swedes. Rolvag arrived at the university in the midst of a great debate. Should Norway become a republic or remain a monarchy? Eventually, the Storting invited a junior prince of Denmark to assume the throne. These political events were actually the capstone to a century-long revival of Norwegian culture, part of a continent-wide age of romantic nationalism. The collection of Norse folk tales, fresh attention to the Viking Age 1,000 years before, nationalist composers such as Edvard Grieg, novelists of the Norwegian countryside, including Bjorne Stjerne Bjornson, and Jonas Lie, and dramatist Henrik Ibsen raised popular Norwegian consciousness to a new level. Rolvag's graduate studies focused on the Norwegian language and literature, subjects he was slated to teach on his return to St. Olaf. This immersion into Norway's cultural revival reinforced his commitment to a life work focused on home, kin, church, and my people. A faith to be expressed in loyalty and courageous labor. His biographers label this orientation an idealist conservatism, which casts the leading task of every generation as embracing the values of the past, keeping them dynamic in the creative life of the present, and sending them into the future progressively reformed and vigorously individual. On a darker note, Rolvag fell ill on Christmas Day, 1905, in Oslo, a lingering ailment that was the first sign of a weak heart that would claim his life in 1931. Rolvag returned to the St. Olaf campus for the autumn term of 1906. As planned, he took on the Norwegian language classes. According to student accounts, he was an energetic lecturer who saw teaching as a mission in terms of physicality. He was described as of the short, thick-set fighting type. He is simple, direct, and fundamental, without a trace of self-consciousness, a man who would compel interest in any gathering. All along, though, Rolvag looked to authoring an epic pioneer book. Earlier efforts at novels would build toward that end. Stimulus to act came from two sources. First, he received word that the contemporary Norwegian novelist Johan Boyer had visited several settlements in America in order to write his own immigrant book. And second, there was mounting attention to the Norwegian-American experience as the 100th anniversary of the start of the migration approached in 1925. Rolvag gained a sabbatical leave from St. Olaf in the 1923-24 academic year and retired to his new cabin on Big Island Lake near Grand Rapids, Minnesota. There he began the work. Now, his first task was to choose a location for the novel. Multiple and important Norwegian settlements had been founded in Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. However, he selected Dakota Territory. The reason was obvious. Any of the other locales would have mandated that he conduct new and extensive historical research. While he had lived in South Dakota, had attended school here, had traveled the countryside on foot for a summer job selling books to farmers, had taught at summer schools operated by South Dakota local churches, and had threshed, preached, loved, and married here. Moreover, his wife Jenny's own family history provided rich material. Her father, Andrew Berdal, had been part of a famed wagon train that had departed Fillmore County, Minnesota in 1873, crossed the southern Minnesota prairie, and settled just inside Dakota Territory near Garrettson in Minnehaha County. Andrew would later become deputy county auditor, gaining deep knowledge of how land claims and settlement patterns actually occurred. It is true that Rolvag did not exactly reproduce the Beardall story. In Giants, the Spring Creek settlement is vaguely located 20 to 25 miles west of the real Beardall farm and the same distance from Sioux Falls. Still, as Rolvag reported to his wife, "Your father is of inestimable service to me in the writing of this book." Producing 5,000 words a day, Rolvag largely completed the first draft of the novel in the cabin on Big Island Lake. In December, with manuscript in hand, he departed for Oslo, seeking a Norwegian publisher. Following diligent salesmanship and refinement of the work, he could report on May 21st, 1924, to family and friends that the prominent Aschehoug publishing house had accepted the book. He added, "This is the greatest day of my life." The Norwegian edition appeared fairly quickly and in two parts. I de Dagen, in those days, was published in autumn 1924, and Riket Grundlages, Founding the Kingdom, in 1925. Both were critical and commercial successes. At this point, none of Rolvag's fiction had appeared in English translation, and he doubted his own ability to do the work. As he commented, "While I speak the English language, it does not sing for me." However, his success in the old country had led to an article in the Minneapolis Journal in early 1926 entitled, "Norway Extols St. Olaf Man." It gained the attention of the experienced American writer Lincoln Colcord, who happened to be in Minneapolis that day. He wrote to Rolvag, asking if any effort at a translation was planned, adding, "I should think that almost any publisher would be glad to undertake the work." The two met, and Colcord opened a door to Harper and Brothers in New York. Editor Eugene Saxton embraced the project. Rough translations of the texts were then sent to Colcord, who reworked them into polished English. That version was then sent to Rolvag for review. The two would then personally meet to finalize the text. Rolvag called this a double action form of translation, and the linguistic richness of the English edition owes much to Colcord's engagement. The two also debated an English title. The publisher had resolved to issue one combined volume instead of two, and in this context, Rolvag liked "In Those Days." Colcord proposed "The Great Land Taking," or alternatively, Giants in Those Days. Also suggested were "A Saga of the Prairie" and "The Saga of Settlement." It was Eugene Saxton at Harper's who brought forward "Giants in the Earth," that wonderfully ambiguous phrase found in the book of Genesis 6:4. The linguist Einar Haugen has, I think, shown pretty convincingly that in the Norwegian Bible, which Rolvag read, the English word giants in this passage is rendered as kjemper, meaning usually heroes or men of great stature. Rolvag and Colcord embraced the proposal with "A Saga of the Prairie" as the subtitle. The volume appeared in late spring 1927. The Book of the Month Club chose Giants as its June selection, with an initial order of 30,000 copies. Critical praise flowed in, and by the end of the year, 78,000 copies had been sold. In the several years which followed, that number climbed to 200,000. Now, the grand literary themes distinctive to Giants in the Earth are several and fairly well known. They include Rolvag's stunning reimaging of the American prairie in the upper Midwest as a sea. The Norwegians were a mountain people, by and large, who could feel lost in the flatness of the prairie lands. The sentiment could be found in Berit's complaint that there was nowhere in their new landscape to hide. However, Rolvag the Lofoten fisherman recast the prairie as a sea to powerful effect. The Norwegian settlers became the Vikings reborn, their covered wagons now ships, rising out of the tall, trembling grass as among waves. In its darker manifestations, the prairie became as heartless as the ocean itself. In related manner, Rolvag also transforms the Dakota prairie into a living thing. It can be glorious, with a wide open sky and momentous sunrises and sunsets, a fertile land overflowing with milk and honey. The prairie can also turn deadly, showing what critic Harold Simonson calls supernatural emanations, a menacing foe with horrible features, a monster seeking to drink the blood of the settlers. The true genius of the novel, though, lies in Rolvag's portrait of the relationship between the central characters, Hansa and Berit. The collision between his optimism and kingdom-building dreams and her yearning for home, her depression, and her fears is one of the great tales of modern literature, presented with both brutal clarity and aching sympathy. Rolvag's personal story so builds on the unique drama and scope of the Norwegian migration to America. From the Old Norse sagas, Rolvag adopts what he calls an epic view of existence, which he blends with the romantic spirit. As he explained, this movement of a population began as a magic word, spring up in the consciousness of the Scandinavian peoples, America. This idea of migration had volcanic power. Human wave after human wave washed across the Atlantic, inundating the lands on the American side. The goal, Rolvag insisted, was neither conquest nor spoilage, but rather to do mighty deeds and build for a greater human happiness. As Rolvag explained in a lecture that he gave on Chicago's WMAQ radio in 1929, a lecture entitled The Vikings of the Western Prairie, unbelievable things happened. Divine comedies, unspeakable tragedies, deeds of valor and daring that surpass anything we know from the days of knighthood. The Viking spirit was certainly not extinct. Behind such rhetorical flourishes did lie some quite astonishing and real numbers. Between 1825 and the late 1920s, approximately half of Norway's population moved to North America, with the vast majority settling in the rural areas of the upper Midwest. By 1931, Rolvag held, there were as many Americans of Norwegian ancestry living in America as there are Norwegians in Norway, approaching 2 million in each place. While such numbers are fluid, and while Rolvag's figures would be at the high end of estimates, it is true that only Ireland saw a greater proportion of its population emigrate in the same period. That movement of a people, though, was heavily driven by tragedy, most notably true starvation deriving from the potato famine. In contrast, aspirations and dreams did seem to drive the Norwegians. As Rolvag explained, I think in a wonderful phrase, on the American prairie was suddenly unleashed the 1,000-year hunger of the poor for a greater human happiness. Again, on the American prairie was suddenly unleashed thousand-year hunger of the poor for a greater human happiness. Which formed, he said, a fairy tale more marvelous than any which the fancy of man has spun. What had taken ages to accomplish in other parts of the globe had, over here, been brought about in the course of 2 generations. Well, immigration historian John Yerdy provides better documented demographic numbers. In 1800, the population of Norway was only 880,000, scattered on a terrain defined by mountains and fjords. Between 1850 and 1890, however, years of peace, the introduction and widespread cultivation of the potato, and use of the smallpox vaccine saw Norway's population soar, more than doubling to 1,893,000 in 1990, with another 500,000 already transplanted to North America. Continued migration during the next 4 decades and a clear rise in completed family size among the immigrants make Rolvag's estimate of 2 million Norwegian Americans by 1930 plausible. This was, Yerdy explains in his really excellent book entitled From Peasants to Farmers, a transatlantic rural-to-rural migration without parallel in modern human history. Reflecting this quality, by 1910, a larger proportion of second-generation Norwegian Americans remained as farmers than found among any other nationality group in the United States. As Rolvag's friend and colleague Valdemar Auger argued, "We are more Norwegian here in the United States than they are in Norway, because the mass of Norwegian immigrants is almost exclusively made up of peasants." What was the cause? The dominant explanation, offered by Norwegian officials in the 19th century and by most historians in the 20th century, was Malthusian, specifically overpopulation. Swelling numbers of peasants without property had reached the saturation point, they say. While not starving, as in Ireland, these rural people were often hungry. When the chance to move to a fabled land of wealth appeared, desperate, poverty-stricken, and underemployed persons seized the opportunity and migrated in droves. However, building on a near mountain of fresh and detailed research into the emigrant-sending areas of Norway, John Yerdy demolishes the Malthusian argument. He shows that throughout the 19th century, food production in Norway more than kept pace with population growth. The potato was a major factor here, along with a doubling in the number of kept animals, providing both more meat and dairy protein. Per capita calorie output of Norwegian farms rose by over 50% in these years. Moreover, a considerable rise in the price for farm products actually improved the economic situation of both farm owners and landless farm workers. This, in turn, lowered the average age of marriage, which led to earlier births and higher overall fertility. All the same, complaints by farm operators during these years normally involved a shortage rather than a surplus of workers. In short, hunger, excessive human numbers, and mounting poverty were not the causes of the migration. What are the better explanations? One account comes from Theodore Blegen, a contemporary friend and correspondent of Rolvag and professor of history at the University of Minnesota. In his 1931 volume, Norwegian Migration to America, 1825 to 1860, he emphasizes that many property-owning family heads in relatively good economic situations were among the earliest migrants. Why? As one immigrant explained in 1866, a man with $1,000 and 5 children in Norway amounted to very little there. However, if I go to America, where there is still plenty of fertile land to be had for next to nothing, my little capital, combined with the industry of myself and my children, is sufficient to furnish all of us an independent and satisfying position. Professor Yerde's later analysis largely agrees with Bleggins. Yerde emphasizes the problem of impartible inheritance in the internal rural provinces of Norway. In these mountainous areas where good cropland was scattered and relatively rare, custom and law dictated that farms be kept intact across the generations. Eldest sons or eldest daughters in families without male heirs would inherit the whole property. This resulted in a growing number of cotter families, the younger siblings now landless adults. Even among the eldest sons, their assumption of ownership and ability to marry commonly depended on care-kontrakten, or contracts of care. These stipulated the rights and claims of the retiring parents and could be fairly onerous and burdensome. So for all young adults in Norway, the availability of cheap land on the American prairie without encumbrances, and that was the key, without encumbrances, became a convenient solution to the scarcity of landed futures. Moreover, Christian piety, Christian pietism, was a mounting cultural force in 19th century Norway. Its qualities included energetic lay preachers, home Bible studies, and moral uprightness. The preachers condemned in particular bundling or night courting, a quite ritualized form of sexual expression found among the cotter and servant classes. A consequence of bundling was a high level of premarital conceptions. Within these close-knit rural communities, however, marriage usually and quickly followed. However, the system was breaking down in the early and middle decades of the 19th century, with more births out of wedlock and more children without active fathers. Both pietist preachers and the ordained Lutheran pastors bore down on night courting. And again, the availability of land in America that would enable early marriage and a landed future for children became the solution. As Yerde nicely summarizes, by traveling in groups or entire households and usually settling in small communities, the Norwegian immigrants hoped to enjoy greater material wealth and a reestablishment of old Christian values in the New World. Viewing the same developments, historian Ingrid Semmingsen concludes that, paradoxically, rural conservatism prompted the migrants to make a radical decision. In seeking to protect an old pattern of Christian agrarian living, they cut all direct ties to their homeland and went to build new communities on another continent. That is radical. In words found near the end of Giants, Rolvag sought to capture the magnitude and sheer audacity of the project. Blindly, they threw themselves into the impossible and accomplished the unbelievable. If anyone succumbed in these struggles, and that happened often, another would come and take his place. Youth was in the race. The unknown, the untried, the unheard of was in the air. People caught it and were intoxicated by it and threw themselves away and laughed. He continued, not since the day man first took up his struggles has the human race known such faith and a like confidence. In Rolvag's telling, and to a considerable degree in the objective historical record, such sentiments frame the epic nature of the Norwegian migration to America. Thank you for your time. And I think there's a few minutes for questions, which I'll just take from the podium right here. Just, yeah, right here. Speak loudly, please. Go ahead. Yeah.
In Norway in the 1880s, he was one of 7 sons. The oldest, who was a twin, immigrated to the United States. The twin stayed behind. His descendants still own family property in Norway. So that's sort of an illustration. And they were not even known to be impoverished. So I think that fits that definition or that description you made. I'm interested in what was Volvog's views. What did he think of Ibsen? Was again, was he influenced? What did he think of someone like Frank Baum? That's sort of his own kind of take on rural life. Was he aware of Baum?
He seemed to have a kind of a mixed view about Ibsen. Some of Ibsen got a little racy, I think might be the best way to put it for his tastes. And he liked the rural authors that I mentioned in my talk. He liked Knut Hamsun. He loved Knut Hamsun's book Growth in the Soil, which won the Nobel Prize in the early 1920s. Which I think again, it's a great agrarian book. And he loved that book. So it was kind of a mixed bag. He was again, Ibsen was, he taught him as a great, one of the greatest dramatists to ever live. But I think inside he had some doubts about maybe he got a little too racy sometimes. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Well, I don't want to spoil the book for those who haven't read it, so I won't go into. But what you say is true. It has a tragic ending. Um, I think this cover, again, this is the painting by Harvey Dunn, captures beautifully, but the main theme of the book. I know this because 50 years ago, my future in-laws, 60, even longer than that, 60 years ago, because I hadn't met my wife to be yet, they were prairie farmers in northern Illinois, but they loved spending time in the Dakotas and also in Montana. And they saw this painting on a visit. I imagine it must have been here to Brookings, must maybe at the wherever that painting sat back in 1957. That's where they saw it. Secured a copy of print. It was a feature in my wife's house when she grew up. Her parents loved this painting, and they debated it endlessly because you look at the picture. It's part of a larger picture. You see the farmstead, but completely in the background. But my father-in-law to be saw this painting as a picture of optimism. They're building a land, they're building a farm, they're building a kingdom. She's picking flowers. It's beautiful. She's got a beautiful child. It's great. My mother-in-law always saw this picture with sadness. Look how haggard she looks. Look how tired she looks. This woman is not happy. She is depressed. And it's just a remarkable coincidence that without my having anything to do with it, the publishers here chose this picture for the cover. But it captures that tension. And it is true that the main female character, Barrett, she would certainly be diagnosed as a depressive today. But she had reasons to be depressed. Is another way to put it too. And that's the remarkable human tension in the story, which does lead to a tragic end. But again, I think the ending is, in a literary sense, it's absolutely perfect. In a human sense, you cry. Any other questions? Yes. You're right. I'm a Swede by background, and Swedes did it too, because otherwise it's just an endless list of Olsons, Johnsons, Carlsons, and Ericssons. It's and some of it was to break out of that. But usually when they chose a name, they chose a Norwegian name. I mean, Wolfag is a good Norwegian name. It's just, but it's not sort of this endless repetition of peasant names. And to try to keep the family name going, you'd have Peter Peterson or John Johnson or Ole Olsen. But that wasn't working so well after several generations. And this was a way of, I think, to some degree, breaking out of a naming system that eventually even the Scandinavians got rid of. Sweden set up a bureau, I think, in the 1930s to help Olsons, Petersons, and Carlsons get distinctive names. They had to be Swedish, though. So, any other questions? I think our time is up. So, thank you very much.